Hello everyone and welcome to another afternoon tea. I hope you're all doing well. An extra welcome to those of you who are new to the channel. I'm very happy to have you here. Today we are going through Jane Austen's first ever finished work, a novella named Lady Susan, possibly written in 1794 but not published until 1871, meaning after her death. And it is very different from her other novels, and quite scandalous indeed. So make sure you have some tea or cookies, like I have here, or any other refreshment of your choice, and let's get into it. Lady Susan Vernon is a beautiful, charming, and cunning woman in her mid to late 30s. At the start of the story, she is a widow of about 4 months, and she's staying with some friends in a town called Langford. Her daughter, 16-year-old Frederica, is safely tucked away with a governess in London, so Lady Susan is free from all constraints. Quite literally. Rejoicing in her newfound freedom as a widow, Susan wastes no time in getting better acquainted with a few men. Most notably, the husband of the friend she's staying at. As one does. Mr. Mainwaring is his name, and she's quite taken with him. Him being married didn't seem to be much more than a practical obstacle for her. So the two of them engaged in some heavy flirtation during her stay there, but that was far from the only scandal caused by the cunning Lady Susan. In their social circle was another man, Sir James Martin. He was quite a lot younger, and not of any real interest to Susan, but she put on the charm for him regardless. You see, she had an ulterior motive. She wanted Sir James for her daughter, Frederica. So when she noticed that the Mainwaring's niece also had an interest in Sir James, she had to up the ante. She managed to get him to make an offer of marriage to Frederica, which was met by passionate disgust. Young Frederica had no desire whatsoever to marry Sir James, and as Lady Susan herself puts it, she was determined to be the torment of her mother's life. But Lady Susan's schemes then finally caught up with her. She became the target of Mrs. Mainwaring's rage and jealousy, either for canoodling with her husband or losing her niece a suitor, or possibly both. So Susan had no choice but to flee, tail between her legs. She then writes to her late husband's brother, Mr. Vernon, about coming for a visit. Now, while Mr. Vernon was happy to receive his sister-in-law, his wife was anything but. Mrs. Vernon had heard all the rumours about Lady Susan, and despite never having met her herself, was firmly set in her low opinion of her. Apart from Lady Susan's scandalous behaviours, Mrs. Vernon had another reason for disliking her. Back when she and Mr. Vernon had been courting, Lady Susan had meddled and tried to persuade him against marrying her. So there is that personal insult as well. So when Lady Susan arrived at their country home, she was given a cordial but chilly reception from Mrs. Vernon. Susan then writes to her BFF, Mrs. Johnson, that she knows Mrs. Vernon dislikes her, but she will win her heart through her children. She knows all of their names already. But she misses her lover, Mr. Mainwaring, and asks Mrs. Johnson to forward a letter from her to him. Then we have Mrs. Vernon's POV as she is writing to her brother, Reginald de Courcy, about her first impressions of Lady Susan. She described her as a dangerous creature. She was uncommonly beautiful and had a gentle, affectionate manner, which would have deceived Mrs. Vernon if she didn't already know her true character. Her brother Reginald had forwarded all of the gossip about Lady Susan's affair in Langford. So Mrs. Vernon felt inclined to invite her brother to stay with them as well. She needed someone in her corner, so to speak. And Reginald accepted the invitation, feeling rather curious about the so-called most accomplished coquette in England. Meanwhile, Lady Susan had now been with the Vernons for a week, which had been pretty dull according to her reports to Mrs. Johnson in London. She also gave her friend some instructions regarding her daughter Frederica, who was staying with a governess there. As she was still determined to have Frederica marry Sir James, she urged Mrs. Johnson to remind him of her to encourage his attachment to her. He will renew his proposal eventually. By that point, Reginald de Courcy had now joined them at Castle Vernon, and Lady Susan found him a handsome young man, and quite saucy, so she hoped that he would be of some amusement. Contrary to what Mrs. Vernon thought when she had invited her brother there, she did not gain an ally against Lady Susan. Quite the contrary, as he and Susan seemed to get along very well. A bit too well. She couldn't understand how he could like her despite knowing what she had done to the Mainwarings. And then Reginald decided to prolong his visit with the excuse that he wanted to go hunting with Mr. Vernon. But his sister knew better. It was all because of Lady Susan. We then get a report from Mrs. Johnson in London. Upon hearing of Reginald de Courcy, she quickly advises Susan to marry him. His father is old and frail and will likely be out of the picture soon, which will mean more money. She can't wait for Mainwaring to divorce, if he even will. Mrs. Johnson also says that she's met Sir James while out in society and found him flirting with Miss Mainwaring again. So she scolded him for that, but he said that it was all a joke and he wasn't actually interested in her. Don't you just love how these two women conspire together? It's like partners in scandal. But Lady Susan has no intention of marrying Reginald. I mean, she knew that he was half in love with her already, but she saw him as no more than a friend. He was nowhere near Mr. Mainwaring's caliber, as he wasn't polished enough. Meanwhile, Mrs. Vernon's unease keeps growing. Her brother's opinion of Lady Susan was now decidedly positive. He even said outright that poor Susan had been subject to slander. She wasn't at all guilty of the gossip that they had heard of her. So Mrs. Vernon writes to their mother, asking her to ask Reginald to come home. But this letter found its way to their father, who was anything but pleased. He wrote to his son himself, expressing in many ways how unsuitable this attachment was. Him marrying Lady Susan was completely out of the question, not just because of her age, but also her character. Reginald had then responded that they had nothing to worry about. Susan wasn't at all guilty of anything untoward. It was the young Miss Mainwaring that had been jealous since she had wanted to marry Sir James Martin, who then wanted to marry Susan's daughter. So it was she that had spread all the rumors because she had felt slighted by him. So there was nothing to worry about with her character at all, in his view. His sister, Mrs. Vernon, is anything but convinced. But they were all soon distracted by some distressing news from London. Frederica had made an escape attempt from her governess. Apparently, she had been so upset by her mother's continued intention to marry her off to Sir James that she had seen no other alternative but to run away. And she even made it 2 whole streets before she was apprehended. But it was now too risky to keep her there, so it was decided that she would be brought to the Vernons, where they could keep an eye on her. Lady Susan had told Mrs. Vernon that they would need to be very strict with Frederica as punishment for her behavior, and for once the 2 women agreed. So Mr. Vernon went to London to fetch Frederica, and they arrived while the others were having tea in the evening. She was visibly distressed and was crying, so Susan took her away to presumably scold her, and Mrs. Vernon noticed how unmoved Susan seemed by her daughter. By her behavior alone, you would think that all was fine and dandy. The days go by, and Mrs. Vernon suspected that Susan kept Frederica away from her on purpose. She had never spoken to her privately, and Frederica hardly ever said a word when they were all together as a group. She didn't even know what the girl was doing all day. Susan had asked for a piano to be moved to their room so that Frederica could practice on it, but there was never any noise coming from the room. Meanwhile, Susan and Reginald kept up their daily habit of walking together in the shrubbery, and Mrs. Vernon suspected that Frederica must have noticed her mother's flirtation. She was 16 after all. She couldn't be completely oblivious to things of that nature. More days go by, and Susan then loosens her grip on Frederica. So Mrs. Vernon seized the opportunity to get to know her and found that she was really a sweet and gentle and obliging girl, far from how Susan had described her. Ever since she had arrived there, she had just been reading in their room. That's why Mrs. Vernon had never heard her practice on the piano. Reginald, however, still held firm in a negative opinion of her. He was basically just repeating what Susan was saying, that she was a lost cause, pretty much. But Mrs. Vernon then observed something interesting. She noticed how Frederica paid special attention to Reginald, listening carefully when he spoke, smiling when he said something amusing, things like that. So she decided on the ultimate plan to play matchmaker between Reginald and Frederica so that he will marry her and forget all about his flirtation with Lady Susan. Frederica had now been with the Vernons for 2 weeks, and even her mother had noticed her partiality towards Reginald. She found it utterly ridiculous, and Reginald was of course completely indifferent to her, the artless simpleton that she is. This woman is harsh. But alas for Frederica, Susan is still set on her marrying Sir James. She's just not sure exactly how to go about it yet. And speak of the devil, Sir James then turned up unexpectedly at the Vernons. Frederica was at that point upstairs with Mrs. Vernon and became immediately distressed as she realized who it was. And then Reginald showed up to tell her that Susan wished to see her in the parlour. And he was quite surprised to see her terrified reaction to this. This is when Mrs. Vernon realizes Lady Susan's plan in marrying off Frederica. So they all go downstairs to the parlour to meet their unwanted guest. And, well, Sir James did not make a good impression. While he was a gentleman, Mrs. Vernon felt that he was a weak-minded, silly and impertinent young man. He even went as far as inviting himself to stay there a few days. I mean, the gall! This man could give John Thorpe a run for his money. So Mrs. Vernon felt sorry for Frederica and understood her reluctance to the marriage. Even Reginald seemed perplexed that Lady Susan would want her daughter married to such a man. Susan had then taken Mrs. Vernon to the side and explained how this was a good match, and she had expressed her gratitude for all the kindness that the Vernons had shown them, how much she cares about them all, etc., etc., and Mrs. Vernon couldn't help but feel that Lady Susan must have been earnest in some way, which just shows how manipulative Lady Susan actually is. So, with Sir James now installed at Castle Vernon as well, Frederica feels desperate. Susan had forbidden her to speak about Sir James to the Vernons, so she ended up writing a note to Reginald, which she gave him while passing him in the hallway. In this note, she begged him to talk to her mother on her behalf and persuade her against the match. Frederica had disliked him from the start. She found him totally disagreeable, and she would rather work for a living than marry him, which was saying a lot back in those days. So Susan was trying to keep her composure despite her vexation over Sir James popping up so unexpectedly. And inviting himself to stay, no less. She didn't want him there, but if anything, she wanted him and Frederica married as soon as possible, before Reginald started returning her affections. She was then rather surprised at being approached by Reginald in this regard. He tried to persuade her against the Sir James match. He had then spoken to Frederica and assured himself of her wishes. This made Lady Susan very angry indeed.
How dare he? He cannot have any true regard for me. I shall always detest them both.
So they get into an argument which left them both pretty upset. And Reginald left, immediately going to his sister in the breakfast parlour and announcing that he will be going home now. This was, of course, very happy news to Mrs. Vernon. He then followed up with asking her not to let Sir James marry Frederica. He was a complete fool and should be sent away. He then left the room, and Lady Susan entered, looking completely unbothered as usual. Susan had indeed composed herself, and realizing the danger of letting Reginald leave in such a low opinion of her, she called him to her room to talk things through. She admitted that there must have been some misunderstanding on her end. She didn't know that Frederica disliked Sir James. Also that it should be her, Susan, leaving and not Reginald, as she wouldn't dream of separating him from his sister. And Reginald believed her, so he decided to stay after all. And to everyone's relief, Sir James was dismissed. Susan then sent a report to her partner in scandal in London, Mrs. Johnson. She told her of how she was planning her revenge on Reginald and Frederica. Who knows, she might even decide to marry him. And yes, that would be revenge enough. As for Frederica, she had decided to take her to London, where she would marry her off to Sir James without any interference from the Vernons. So she asked Mrs. Johnson to find her some suitable accommodations there. Mrs. Johnson replied with the advice that Susan should leave Frederica behind with the Vernons. It would be more beneficial to her to stay in Reginald's good graces and marry him, and not irritate them all further by forcing Frederica into a marriage she doesn't want. She also mentioned that Mainwaring was in town. She sees him from time to time. He appeared to be very jealous that Susan was socializing with Reginald de Courcy out in the country. And if she doesn't come to town soon, he might go there unexpectedly as well. So Lady Susan follows her friend's advice and leaves for London after 10 weeks in total with the Vernons. She left Frederica behind, to Mrs. Vernon's great relief. As for Reginald, he returned to his parents with the assurance that he will join Lady Susan in London at a later point, and once that happens, they will get married. Lady Susan then arrives in London and gets settled in the apartments that Mrs. Johnson had procured for her. And pretty much immediately, Mr. Mainwaring appeared on her doorstep. She was very happy to see him, still thinking him far superior to Reginald. It even made her doubt whether she actually wanted to marry Reginald, especially with his father still alive. That one was difficult to say. But regardless, for the time being, she would keep her intentions with Reginald a secret from Mainwaring, as he was far too jealous. And it was equally as important that Reginald did not come to London before Mainwaring had left. A lot of things to consider when one has multiple relationships, apparently. So Susan writes to Reginald asking him to stay in the countryside a bit longer. They must think of her reputation, as she had only been a widow for 10 months. How would it look if she was to announce another marriage so quickly? No, they must keep a low profile. Much to Susan's annoyance, her letter had the opposite effect, and Reginald hurried to London. Perhaps he knew, deep down, that there was something suspicious in her request that he stays away. He then turned up at her apartments, which caused a bit of a panic in Susan. She had a date with Mainwaring planned. He would be there in half an hour. So she sent Reginald over to Mrs. Johnson's with some excuse, and also scribbled a note for him to deliver for her. In this note, she urged Mrs. Johnson to talk some sense into Reginald and get him to leave town again. But alas for Susan, Mrs. Johnson wasn't even at home when Reginald arrived there. And on top of that, he wasn't the only visitor. A devastated Mrs. Mainwaring was there too, as she had decided to see Mr. Johnson about her husband's affair with Lady Susan, and she was hoping that Mr. Johnson could get her husband to give it up. So Reginald walked in on all of this, pretty much, and it didn't take long for him to get filled in on all the details. Once Mrs. Johnson had returned home, it was all too late and she was powerless to stop it. The drama is unfolding. Lady Susan doesn't sweat, however. She will just have to talk to him and smooth things over that way. As expected, she gets a letter from Reginald, which was sent from his hotel, saying that the spell is broken. Now he sees her for what she really is. Nothing more needed to be said. This is the final farewell. So she replies to him using the same manipulative tactics as before, reminding him that she's already told him the whole story about Mrs. Mainwaring's false jealousy, that this was all slander, etc., etc., and she asks him to come to her so that they can talk. But But Reginald has had enough. He wrote all the details given him by Mrs. Mainwaring. That Susan had formed a relationship with her husband during her time there as a guest, and continued a secret correspondence with him afterwards, and now he's visited her privately every single day since they came to London. And Lady Susan's last reply was basically, sorry to hear that, and finished off with saying that his father will surely be happy about his obedience. So, quite passive-aggressive, one could say. Shortly after this, Susan receives a letter from Mrs. Johnson declaring that she must give up their friendship. Her husband, Mr. Johnson, had never really been a fan of Susan, but learning of her affair with Mainwaring was the final nail in the coffin. And he had threatened his wife that if she did not cease all contact with Lady Susan, he would move them out to the country. Permanently. The horror! So poor Mrs. Johnson felt like she had no choice. She couldn't possibly leave town, so Susan had to go. She also mentioned that the Mainwarings are to go their separate ways, and that their niece, Miss Mainwaring, had come to town now as well, determined to marry Sir James. In this last letter to Susan, her partner in scandal, she gave her one final piece of advice: to snag Sir James for herself before Miss Mainwaring could get to him. Susan replied to her with dignified solidarity. She completely understood her friend's predicament and would eagerly await their renewed contact once Mrs. Johnson was free from her husband, aka widowed. She also reports that Mr. Mainwaring is as devoted to her as ever, alluding to them possibly marrying. She was so tired of yielding to the will of others. Now she was determined to bring Frederica to town and marry her to Sir James. May Miss Mainwaring tremble. Yes, that line is in the book, and I love it. So off she goes to the Vernons to pick up poor Frederica. The Vernons protested, of course, but there was nothing they could do. Mrs. Vernon only managed to quickly tell Frederica to let them know if she was mistreated in any way. Mrs. Vernon and the others then went to visit her parents and Reginald, where Reginald told her all of the juicy details about his dealings with Lady Susan. And Mrs. Vernon was absolutely horrified and was determined to get Frederica away from such a mother. So she and Mr. Vernon went to London, and Susan was super cheerful, as always, acting like there was no bad blood between them at all. However, she was in no mood to give up her daughter to them, despite how hard they tried. And it was only once a dangerous influenza broke out in town that they managed to persuade her. So Frederica was finally free and back with the Vernons in the country. 3 weeks later, it was announced that Lady Susan had married, but not Mainwaring. No, she had married Sir James. Anything to stop Miss Mainwaring from having him, I guess. In time, the letters fizzled out, and a few months later, she had stopped writing to them, and Frederica was now fixed permanently with the Vernons. And after some encouragement on Mrs. Vernon's part, she managed to persuade Reginald to marry Frederica. So the man that was supposed to be Frederica's husband is now her father-in-law, and the man that was supposed to be her father-in-law is now her husband. As disturbing as all of that sounds, that is the end of the story. So, I thought this was a very enjoyable read, despite it being an epistolary novel, or rather novella in this case. You know I'm not a huge fan of those. If you didn't know, an epistolary novel is made up of letters or diary entries and has hardly any traditional narration in it. But as a Jane Austen story, it is very different from all of the others. I mean, I'm a little shocked at her writing a character such as Lady Susan, although she is a bit of a cartoon villain, as we never really get any motives for why she does things. There is no justification for any of her behaviors, or attempted justification. And definitely not in the case of Frederica and why she's so adamant on her marrying Sir James. But that's completely fine. I mean, given that Jane Austen never published this one herself, and that it was likely written in the 1790s, it is entirely possible that this was just a writing exercise for her, and was never intended to be read by anyone. Which would be a shame, as it's really delightful and very funny. And if it really was written in 1794, that means that Jane Austen wasn't more than 19 years old when she wrote it. And that's impressive. I mean, it's far better than anything I wrote at 19 years old. Now, I want to know what all of you watching think. Did you enjoy the story? Was there something you disliked about it? Give me all of your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more, then I can highly recommend one of these examples. Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope to see you back next time.